watching the body of a king relieve itself in surgery as a fashion statement. The disgusting reality of Versailles, November 18, 1686. The most powerful palace on earth. Gold ceiling stretching so high you'd need to crane your neck just to see where the grandeur ends. Gardens so vast they take an hour to walk from one end to the other, and somewhere inside that fortress of power and perfume, a man is screaming without making a sound. Not metaphorically, literally, silently. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute ruler of France, the man whose name made foreign monarchs sweat, is lying on his back, fully conscious, while a surgeon cuts into his body with a blade. No sedation, no anesthesia. Just willpower, royal dignity, and the kind of pain that would make most men faint before the first incision. Why, and the room is not empty. There are witnesses. There are always witnesses in Versailles. That moment, the most powerful man in Europe lying exposed and bleeding while an audience watched, is actually the perfect introduction to what Versailles really was, not a palace, a performance. And every single body function of the king, every meal, every surgery, every morning routine was part of the show. If you've ever watched a film set in Versailles and thought it looked glamorous, I want you to hold on to that image for a moment, because by the time we're done here, that image is going to be replaced by something considerably more honest and considerably more disgusting. Everything you're about to hear is documented. Medical records, diplomatic dispatches, the private memoirs of the courtiers who lived inside those gilded walls. None of it is invented. The truth about Versailles is stranger than anything a screenwriter would dare to make up. And honestly, if you enjoy this kind of history, the real version, not the sanitized one, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. There's a lot more where this came from. Let's start at the beginning. Or more accurately, let's start at the very first moment of Louis's day, because it tells you everything you need to know about how power actually worked at Versailles. Every morning, the king's bedroom filled with people. Not servants, not doctors, nobles, princes, dukes, members of the most powerful families in France, standing in an elaborately choreographed sequence, waiting their turn to hand the king his shirt, help him put on his shoes, or simply stand within earshot while he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. And this ritual had a name, the Lever du Roi, the King's Rising. It was broken into precise stages called entries, and each one had a defined hierarchy of who was allowed in. The premier entree admitted the king's closest family and doctors. Later groups included dukes, marshals, ambassadors. Hundreds of people could cycle through the king's bedchamber during a single morning, all competing for proximity to the royal body. You might be wondering why any sane person would want to watch a man get dressed. And that's exactly the right question, because the answer tells you everything about how Louis XIV designed his court. Physical proximity to the king was power, literal, transactional, measurable power. If you were in the room when the king made an offhand comment about a ministry appointment, you had information. And if you could catch his eye while he was relaxed and sleepy, you could plant a word in his ear. If you were present, you existed in the political world of France. If you were absent, you were forgetting. Louis had deliberately removed the nobility from their regional power bases and concentrated them at Versailles, where they competed obsessively for his attention. He kept them busy chasing proximity. He kept them dependent. He kept them under his roof, where he could watch them. And the Lever du Roi was just the beginning of the morning ceremony, because at some point during that elaborately staged ritual, the king had a biological need that couldn't be postponed. And in Versailles, that need became a ceremony too, the chaise percée. In French, the name translates literally as the pierced chair. It was exactly what it sounds like, a chair with a hole cut into the seat with a porcelain basin fitted underneath. In an era before modern plumbing, it was the standard toilet substitute for European aristocracy. But Louis XIV's chaise percée was not a standard piece of furniture. According to preserved inventories of the palace, the king's chair was upholstered in deep crimson velvet. Gold studs ran along the edges. The porcelain basin beneath it was fine quality. It was the most expensive toilet in human history, and it sat in the king's bedchamber like a throne within a throne. When nature called, the king did not dismiss the room. He sat down, and the audience stayed. This is the part that tends to make modern people's jaws drop. But it made complete logical sense within the system Louis had created. And the moments when the king was seated on the chaise percée were, paradoxically, the moments when he was most approachable. He was stationary. He was, in a strange way, vulnerable. He couldn't suddenly walk away. And so courtiers treated those minutes as an opportunity. Petitions were presented, military matters were discussed, diplomatic concerns were raised. All while the king was relieving himself, feet flat on the floor, courtiers arranged at a respectful distance, the air in the room carrying exactly the kind of smell you would expect. And people competed for this privilege, savagely. The Duke of Saint-Simon, whose memoirs are one of the most vivid primary sources we have from Versailles, described the politics of the morning ritual in careful, almost breathless detail. At being present during the king's most intimate moments was a signal to the entire court. It meant the king trusted you. It meant you had access. It meant you mattered. Nobles who were excluded would maneuver for months, sometimes years, for the chance to be admitted to the room. Some never achieved it. Think about what Louis had engineered here. He had taken the single most private act a human being performs, a moment that even the most extroverted person on earth typically wants solitude for, and turned it into a public competition. He controlled access to his own defecation like a resource, and the most powerful men in France lined up jostling for position, grateful for the opportunity to be in the room. He had them completely. It's easy to look at that from the outside and think those courtiers were ridiculous. But ask yourself how many people today perform embarrassing rituals just to be close to power. The costumes change. The dynamic doesn't. This, though, was just the political dimension of the king's body. The medical dimension was considerably darker, and it started with what Louis XIV ate. The royal kitchens at Versailles operated like a military operation. Dozens of cooks, hundreds of support staff, multiple kitchens running simultaneously, all of it organized to produce the staggering quantity of food that the king consumed at a single sitting. The preserved kitchen records of Versailles, studied by historians, detail meals that read, less like a menu and more like a challenge. Multiple courses of soup, whole roasted birds, haunches of meat, elaborate pastries loaded with a refined sugar, and which in the 17th century was so expensive it was practically a luxury material. Sugar was called white gold, and only the wealthiest households in Europe could afford it in abundance. Bottles of wine, plural, at every meal. The king's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Charlotte of Bavaria, known at court as the Duchess of Orleans, described his eating habits in letters that have been preserved. She wrote of watching Louis consume 4 full bowls of soup, an entire pheasant, a partridge, mutton, ham, a salad, pastries, fruit, and sweets in one sitting, and he did this 3 times a day. The caloric intake was enormous, something in the range of what a team of laborers might need to sustain themselves through a week of physical work compressed into a single meal. The consequences were predictable, and they were relentless. Our chronic digestive suffering, the kind of intestinal discomfort that never fully went away, constipation alternating with diarrhea, pain that became background noise in the king's daily life, And then in 1686, the background noise became a crisis. Louis XIV developed an anal fistula. If you're not familiar with the medical term, here's what it means in plain language. An abscess, a pocket of infection, had formed near the king's rectum, and it had tunneled. It had bored a passage between the internal tissue and the outer skin, creating a channel that continuously drained infected material. It is extraordinarily painful. In the 21st century, it requires surgery to resolve. In the 17th century, it was potentially fatal. The man who commanded European armies, whose word could redraw the borders of nations, could not sit down without the kind of pain that makes you catch your breath. His famous chaise percée, the velvet upholstered symbol of his political theater, had become an instrument of torture, and every soul in Versailles knew it. Ambassadors were writing dispatches to their governments about the king's condition. The phrase, "the king's health," became a coded topic in diplomatic correspondence across the continent. Wagers were being placed in certain circles about whether he would survive the year. If you're listening to this and thinking this sounds like an extraordinary amount of scrutiny for one man's medical condition, well, yes. But Louis XIV was France. His body was, in a very real sense, a matter of state. Whatever happened to that body happened to a kingdom of roughly 20 million people. Something had to be done. And a man named Charles-François Félix was going to do it. Félix was the king's chief surgeon. He was skilled, he was ambitious, and he was terrified. Not because the surgery was beyond him in theory. An anal fistula in the right hands could be treated. But this was not an ordinary patient. If Charles-François Félix operated on the King of France and failed, there was a plausible path from the operating room to the executioner's block. In the absolute monarchy that Louis had built, failure with the king's body was not a resume entry. It was a death sentence. Félix made a decision that was rational in the coldest possible sense. He practiced. According to medical records from the period, Félix spent months before the royal operation refining his technique on prisoners and the poor, people who had no ability to refuse. He designed new instruments specifically for this procedure. A curved bistouri, a thin, elongated surgical blade built to navigate the specific anatomy required. He called it the bistouri à la royale. That instrument exists today. You can see it preserved at the Musée de l'Assistance Publique in Paris. He ran through his procedure again and again on people whose names history did not record, adjusting, correcting, improving. Some of those unnamed people died from infection in the days following. Some died on the table. Félix studied each failure and used it to sharpen his approach. By the time he walked into the king's chamber on November 18, 1686, he had performed this surgery dozens of times. He knew exactly what he was doing. What he could not prepare the king for was the pain. Louis XIV lay back, fully conscious. No anesthesia existed. A small quantity of wine, perhaps at the margins, but nothing that would genuinely blunt what was coming. Félix made his first incision. The king did not cry out. Witnesses reported it afterward, slightly awed. The king bore the procedure without audible complaint. Félix cut and drained and worked through multiple passes, addressing the tissue and the abscess with hands steadied by months of practice. The operation stretched across hours and required follow-up sessions in the weeks after. More cutting, more drainage, more recovery. In the end, it worked. The fistula healed. Louis XIV survived, and Charles-François Félix was rewarded with 300,000 livres, a fortune that could sustain a household for generations, plus a grant of land and a title of nobility. The most celebrated surgeon in Europe was built on a foundation of experiments performed on people who never had a choice. Now here is where the story takes a turn that is almost impossible to believe. Except it's documented, multiple sources, confirmed. If you're driving right now, you might want to turn this up a bit, because what happened next in Versailles says something about human nature that is genuinely unsettling. The king recovered slowly. In the weeks after the operation, the court noticed things. Louis walked differently, a slight adjustment in his gait to accommodate the healing tissue. He sat at an angle. Bandages and dressings were visible beneath certain garments. In the logic of Versailles, a world where every detail of the king's body was a political text, this carried meaning. The dressings meant the king had suffered, and the limp meant he had endured something. And in a court that measured proximity to power in inches, sharing the king's experience was the closest thing to sharing his essence. Courtiers began requesting the same surgery. Healthy men, no fistula, no abscess, no medical indication whatsoever. They went to surgeons and demanded to be cut in the same location the king had been cut so that they could wear the same bandages, walk with the same adjustment in their stride, sit at the same deliberate angle. Not all surgeons complied, but some did. Documented in contemporary accounts, a wave of voluntary surgical mutilation among healthy French nobility performed purely as a demonstration of loyalty and fashionable identification with the king. The historian Antonia Fraser, among others who have studied this period, has cited this episode as one of the most extreme examples of how Versailles distorted human behavior. When the culture of a place is sufficiently powerful, sufficiently total, when every signal in your environment points toward proximity to one man as the only thing that matters. This is what you get. People who would otherwise be considered perfectly rational, cutting their own bodies to match the king's wound. Hold that thought, because I want to come back to it. But first, a question for those listening. What was the detail in this story so far that surprised you most? The defecation ceremonies? The experimental surgeries on prisoners? The voluntary self-mutilation? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know which part of Versailles reality hit hardest. Now, the surgery was not the most invasive medical intervention Louis XIV regularly received. Not even close. 17th century medicine operated on a theory that seems almost poetic in how completely, catastrophically wrong it was. The human body, physicians believed, was governed by 4 substances called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These ideas trace back to the ancient physician Galen, and they had dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years. When a person fell ill, the theory went, their humors had fallen out of balance. The cure was to purge the excess, bleed the patient, induce vomiting, or most commonly, flush the intestines. The instrument for this last intervention was called a clyster, and it was exactly as unpleasant as the name suggests. Imagine a large syringe, metal or wood. In the 17th century, fitted with a long nozzle. The nozzle was inserted rectally. The plunger was pressed. Liters of warm liquid, water mixed with herbs, sometimes wine, sometimes medications of variable toxicity, were pumped directly into the intestines. The theory was that this flushed away harmful substances and restored balance. The theory was entirely wrong, but the belief in it was absolute. Louis XIV received this treatment regularly. The medical records of Versailles, painstakingly studied by medical historians in the modern era, document more than 2,000 clysters administered to the king over the course of his life. 2,000. That works out to roughly 1 every 10 days across 5 decades of his reign. During illness, the frequency increased, sometimes multiple treatments in a single day. Hang in the king did not pause his schedule. Picture this scene, and I want you to sit with it for a moment because it is genuinely difficult to process. A foreign ambassador arrives at Versailles. He has traveled for weeks, by horse, by carriage, across muddy roads, to secure an audience with the most powerful ruler in Europe. He is finally admitted to the private chambers. He begins his diplomatic presentation. The king is seated. A physician is at his side. And as the ambassador describes trade agreements and border negotiations, a clyster is being administered. Litres of liquid are being introduced into the royal intestines via a metal instrument. The king's expression remains composed. His posture is as formal as protocol requires. He nods. He responds. The ambassador continues. Nobody in the room acknowledges what is happening. Worse, to acknowledge it would be to suggest it was unusual. In Versailles, it was not unusual. It was just Tuesday. Courtiers who wrote memoirs from this era described the clyster sessions with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to describe banquet seating arrangements. It was a feature of the court, like the fountains in the garden. Present, ongoing, unremarked upon. This is what total power does to social norms. When one person is elevated far enough above everyone else, the entire social reality of the room reconfigures around whatever that person's life contains. 2,000 violations of bodily dignity administered in the presence of Europe's most powerful politicians, and every single person involved filed it under normal. Now, if you think the clysters were the peak of the medical horror in Louis XIV's life, I have to tell you there was one final chapter in the story of the king's body, and it managed to be simultaneously more gruesome and more darkly absurd than everything that came before. It started with sugar, the refined sugar that filled Versailles' pastry kitchens, that white gold that only the wealthiest households in Europe could afford, destroyed Louis XIV's teeth. By his 40s, the decay was severe. Multiple teeth had rotted to the point of constant pain. His breath, according to memoirs from the period, was noticeable even in a court where regular bathing was not a feature of daily life. And the royal physicians arrived at a solution that was, by the medical standards of the 17th century, completely logical. Remove the teeth. The rotted ones, certainly. But in the logic of humoral medicine, in the belief that decay spread corruption through the body, the answer was to clear the field. All of the upper teeth, gone. In one session. The king sat in a chair, no anesthetic, one by one, with the instruments available in 1686, which is to say with tools that resembled pliers more than anything a modern dentist would recognize. The royal dentist extracted practically every tooth from Louis's upper jaw. And again, the king said nothing. Jaw set, eyes forward. Dignified silence while his mouth was systematically dismantled. But the dentist made an error. Extracting teeth from a living person requires force. And in this case, the force required was applied with such intensity, and the roots of the teeth had fused so thoroughly with the surrounding bone that part of the palate fractured, and the roof of the king's mouth cracked, a hole formed, a perforation connecting the oral cavity directly to the nasal passage. The physicians attempted to close it. They cauterized the edges with heated instruments, pressed burning metal against the wound to seal it. The procedure caused additional damage and failed to seal the opening. A second attempt, same result. The hole remained. And now, at the formal banquets of Versailles, those elaborate multi-hour ceremonies of courtly dining where ambassadors and nobles observed the king's every motion, Louis XIV had to eat and drink with a new, permanent complication. Liquids did not always stay where liquids were supposed to stay. Soup taken from a spoon, wine lifted in a crystal glass, a sip of water. Any of these at any moment might travel upward through the perforation, all through the nasal passage, and emerge at the king's nostril. The Sun King, the architect of European absolutism, the man who had remade France in his image, sitting at the head of the most opulent table on the continent with wine trickling from his nose while 200 courtiers pretended not to notice. Royal dignity demanded that everyone maintain the fiction, no reaction, no acknowledgement. If the king's nose ran with Burgundy, then Burgundy running from a royal nose was simply what happened at Versailles, and the appropriate response was to continue discussing the harvest or the Italian campaign or whatever was on the evening's agenda. According to the memoirs of the era, Louis eventually adapted. He learned the precise angle at which to hold his head while eating. He avoided certain liquids. He developed, through painful trial and error, a technique for consuming a meal without the most visible manifestation of the problem. But the problem never fully resolved, and the court adapted around it. Let me paint you the full picture one more time, because I think it deserves to be held as a single image. Here is what Versailles actually was: the palace where every monarch in Europe wanted to build a replica, the symbol of refined civilization, absolute power, artistic achievement, the standard against which every other court measured itself. And at the center of it, a man whose body had been transformed into a public event. His bowel movements took place in front of an audience that competed for the privilege of attendance. His intestines were flushed with metal instruments while diplomats watched and said nothing. He survived a surgery that his surgeon had rehearsed on prisoners who had no choice in the matter. He inspired healthy, wealthy, rational noblemen to voluntarily mutilate their own bodies to share in his wound. He ate at the grandest tables in Europe with wine occasionally appearing at his nostril, surrounded by people contractually obligated to pretend it wasn't happening. This was not the exception to Versailles, this was Versailles. The gold and the infection were the same thing. The formality and the grotesque were the same thing. The power and the humiliation, both the king's humiliation of his courtiers and his body's humiliation of him, were all running simultaneously, all the time in those gilded halls. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to, the detail that I think is the most revealing of all. None of the people involved thought any of this was strange. Not the courtiers who competed to witness the king's defecation, not the ambassador who continued his diplomatic presentation during the clyster, not the surgeon who practiced on prisoners, not the nobles who went under the knife to match the king's wound. Because when you are inside a system powerful enough, when the walls of that system are high enough and the incentives inside it are strong enough, whatever the system contains becomes normal. The walls of Versailles were very high, and what those walls normalized is something that from the outside should make us ask some uncomfortable questions about the systems we currently inhabit. Every detail in this story comes from documented sources. The medical records preserved in French archives, the memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of life at Versailles, diplomatic dispatches from foreign ambassadors, the preserved surgical instruments of Charles-François Félix. Historians of 17th century medicine have studied these materials extensively, and none of what you've heard here required embellishment. The truth about Versailles is more disturbing than fiction, and I think that's why it's worth understanding. Before you go, tell me in the comments if you had to pick one moment from this story, one detail that genuinely unsettled you, what would it be? I read every comment, and if you've been listening for a while and haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. This kind of history, documented, specific, yes, and completely unlike anything you learned in school, is what this channel is built on. There's another story queued up on your screen right now. I won't tell you what it is, but if Versailles showed you anything today, it's that the most powerful places in history had the most carefully hidden secrets. The next one is no different. I'll see you there.